The development of political parties was the unwelcome and unanticipated surprise development after the ratification of the Constitution. The framers of the Constitution had hoped and believed that they could avoid a permanent two-party political system because parties were regarded as factions and they were regarded as self-interested groups that pursued their own interests at the expense of the majority. But as we know, parties began to develop almost immediately. The Federalists centered around George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and then the Democratic Republicans centered around Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And these parties were not just parties among the elite politicians in the nation's capital. They permeated down to the grassroots level. And what we see happening in New Jersey in the 1790s is a very intense political polarization, a very strong and dramatic growth in partisanship. And we can track this through the state elections, through the federal elections, through the election of 1800 and onward. And unlike some states, which were dominated by one party or the other, New Jersey was actually a place where there was a fairly even split between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. When there is that kind of deep division, each side wants to bring out the vote.
I don't think it's at all a surprise that the first attempt to enfranchise women and free Blacks occurred at a time when political parties were out scrambling to find more voters. I mean, that's really what the suffrage movement has been about from the very beginning. Why do we need new voters? Why should we bother to let this group or that group? And we see it all around us today. In fact, a lot of the divisions that were there in New Jersey are very visible today. Immigrants, persons of color, women.
We think from the evidence in newspapers and pamphlets and political leaders at the time that these female voters of New Jersey tended to vote Federalist, but we don't know for sure until we actually can examine who these voters were. Now, what's fascinating here is that both sides wanted the women and actually free Black people who met the property qualifications to vote for them. And we see that there are comments and commentary in the newspapers about women going to the polls. There are also criticisms of women going to the polls because some say, and I don't think we know enough to know if it's true, but the women are being manipulated, that the women are simply the pawns or the agents of the political parties. But I think we know from other kinds of evidence from educated women in other states that women at this time often were very politically well informed, that they were knowledgeable about politics, and they certainly didn't need the push of men to exercise their franchise or to decide whom to vote for. These women were exercising their agency. They went to the polls and cast their ballots on the same terms as men, and they voted in local, state, and federal elections. So they were fully enfranchised voters in New Jersey.
There's been some fascinating research done on the broad women's suffrage movement in the United States, which really shows, regardless of how effective the campaign for suffrage, it just didn't happen unless there was political competition that was pushing people to think there'd be an advantage to adding new voters. And that, that's based on the periods 1890 to 1920 in legislative actions for suffrage. But when we look at New Jersey, gosh, it looks a lot like that.